I'm Nicholas Jones, and in the 80s, I covered the big disputes of the Thatcher decade, like the miners' strike and the Wapping dispute. And what was so important about it is that I was filing for BBC Radio, so I often had to be there at the scene. And of course, the miners' strike and their defeat in 1984-5 had a dramatic effect on the morale of the trade union movement. And I think employers, and especially the newspaper proprietors, sensed that, because the newspapers had been in a long, long tussle with the print unions, unions like the National Graphical Association and the Society of Graphic and Allied Trades. They were very powerful trade unions. And what had happened is that, of course, there'd been a revolution in printing. There'd been new computerized systems for setting the type. There'd been the introduction of new offset litho equipment. Now, the newspapers were way behind. Rupert Murdoch sensed the change in the atmosphere. What was going on was that within the old printing establishments, there was what was called hot metal. You literally had the typesetting done by a linotype machine, and that was hot metal, and then that was transferred onto a hot metal tape, and the print was actually printed off these hot metal plates. It was called the hot metal technology. Now, that had all been overtaken by computerized setting of type. You could do it all on a computer, and of course there were new modern printing systems. Now then, you have to look at the newspapers at the time, you see. They were very inky and smudgy because it was an old-fashioned form of printing. The national newspapers couldn't print color pictures, so they were demanding change, but they were running into problems with the print unions, which were very powerful and were resisting the sort of working practices which the employers wanted to introduce. Rupert Murdoch seized the moment in 1986. What had happened was that he'd been building up a new computerized printing plant at a place called Wapping with these new printing machines and this new computerized technology. And of course, it would mean a dramatic reduction in the number of jobs.
Murdoch had moved into the British market, hadn't he? Taking over very important titles like The Sun, The News of the World and The Times.
Rupert Murdoch had been a sort of breath of fresh air in the newspaper industry because he'd come in, he'd bought the News of the World, he'd bought the Sun newspaper and actually transformed that into the biggest selling newspaper in the country. He'd also been allowed, and it had been agreed by Mrs. Thatcher, that he could take over the Times and the Sunday Times. So he was the leading publisher in the country, and there was no doubt about it. He was determined to move to new technology, and he set up Wapping as a sort of as a plant where he knew he could produce his new newspapers. It was just to the east of Fleet Street, not far away, and there he had invested in all this new equipment. He was secretly recruiting members of another trade union called the Electricians Union, and they were manning this new computerized equipment and this new computerized press works, and they were getting ready, he said, to publish a new newspaper called the London Post. But it was all a bit of a smokescreen. And in the January of 86, Murdoch, who had been negotiating with the unions, it was pretty clear those negotiations were getting nowhere. And then the unions dramatically called a strike, an all-out strike.
Let's set the scene a bit, because the Wapping is actually part of the old East London docks that was being kind of run right down, being replaced by big ports like Harwich. It was almost like a kind of wasteland, and this is where Murdoch was building his plant.
Yes, it was at the start of Docklands, just after the Tower of London, near St Catherine's Docks, and this was a sort of one of those what we call the brownfield sites where this new investment had taken place. It wasn't far from Fleet Street, and what had happened was that when he was faced by this strike by the 5,500 print workers that he employed in London, you can see how many people had got jobs there. And they had refused to accept the new working conditions he was proposing. He immediately sacked them all. because under the employment legislation, it was possible if you went on strike, you lost your job. So he sacked them all. And that began this all-out dispute that went on for a year. Now, what happened then was dramatic, because he had secretly been training a new workforce in Wapping, in this new print plant, and the journalists were sort of faced with an ultimatum. Literally, the journalists had a pistol held to their heads. Either you all bunk off on the Sunday night and start work at Wapping on Monday morning, or you'll be considered a striker.
That's a very awkward position to be put in. Was there an element, do you think, though, of Luddism here? The Luddites just simply refusing to accept that the technological changes were inevitable?
That had been part of the problem. There was no doubt about it that the print unions, the NGA, the National Graphical Association, and the Society of Graphical and Allied Trades, they had been all powerful. They had ruled the roost in the Fleet Street printing works for so long. And I think, it literally exceeded their real power. They didn't realize that events were moving so quickly, that this new technology was coming in, and that the sooner they understood what was happening, the better for them. Now, you could look at the comparison, you see, with the miners' strike, where again, you see the miners' workforce were determined that their industrial strength was going to stop pit closures. But of course, we knew that the role of pit closures, it was inevitable, because less and less coal was being needed by the power generation stations, because we were switching to gas. So the writing was on the wall. But of course, the union went ahead with with the miners' strike and were defeated. And the print workers embarked on a similar all-out strike. They believed that they were going to be able to stop Murdoch.
Do you think both for Arthur Scargill and the miners and the print unions at Wapping that these were quite colossal strategic errors, Nick, in hindsight?
Historically, I think there were. I mean, I think, you see, I'm an if-only man with regard to the miners' strike. I believed it would have been possible. For example, there were 180,000 miners, a couple of hundred pits. I think it would have been possible to have sat down and guaranteed a long-term future for the coal industry. What it required was a guarantee of supply of coal without strike action, which would have encouraged a government of the day to invest in the next generation of clean burn power stations. It didn't happen. And the same applies to the print industry. There was no way that the print unions were going to stop the dramatic change. You didn't need so many print workers. You didn't need hot metal. It was all going to be done in a computerized way. I mean, back in the day when I worked on the Times, I mean, you typed your story out. I was at the press gallery in the House of Commons. You would type it out on your typewriter. There would be a messenger, a man, who would then immediately take it to the Times office, where it would then be set in hot metal by another person. And there were these multiple jobs. And of course, they were going to disappear. The writing was on the wall. And I think the print unions should have realized then that what was needed, was a sensible approach. What we have to look at, you see, in retrospect, is that, of course, once, as happened with the Wapping dispute, it went on, you see, until the February of 1987, for getting on for a year, a full year, 11 months, I think, was the timing of the whole dispute. And of course, what happened then was that the other newspaper employers realized, that the print working unions were not going to be able to stop the production of Murdoch's newspapers, because they went ahead. And we can talk about how that happened as well, because that's a very interesting point. But the important point was that immediately after Wapping, the rest of the print employers, like the big Daily Mail group and the Telegraph group, they just threw money. They just offered the print workers redundancy packages which were too good to refuse, and they just bought out the jobs. They just bought it out, and the print unions just caved in. There was no way that they could stop what was happening. So that sort of revolution, which had been triggered by Murdoch, then just swept through the printing industry.
So most of us know about the pitched battles fought in
Yes.
the miners' strike in 1984. It's also worth remembering that people don't know that there were massive strikes back in the 1970s too, which were almost a kind of precursor to the big battle with Scargill and Thatcher in 1984. But what was going on down in Wapping? Because I imagine
Well,
that there were attempts to try and stop workers getting into the Wapping plant, Murdoch's Wapping plant.
yes. Yes, it became like a sort of fortified print works because it was surrounded by barbed wire. But what was so significant, especially to me, having covered the miners' strike, was the sort of almost sense of collusion. What we have to understand is that Mrs. Thatcher had won the miners' strike. The police, yes, whatever you might say about Orgreave or complaints about brutality, but the police had held the line. There was no doubt about it. They had corralled the miners. They'd been unable to carry out what they threatened that they wanted to do. And the same happened at Wapping. So the print workers valiantly picketed the Wapping plant. But what we saw was a very slick police operation. And what happened was that Murdoch, you see, had really thought this through. So in the early 80s, newspapers were still taken around the country, printed in London, and often taken by overnight trains out to the distribution centres. He had already arranged for that whole job to be overtaken, and he was going to introduce road delivery by a big firm called TNT. So the newspapers were now being printed at Wapping. So you've got the Sun and the Times. They would be printed, and massive lorries would head out of Wapping through the picket lines and take the newspapers around the country. So he'd completely bypassed the previous system for the distribution of newspapers. That was part of Murdoch's success. And of course, the print workers tried so valiantly to stop this, but there were no match for the police. We saw mounted police yet again, and I was struck so much with the similarity with the miners' strike. You see, when you think back to the miners' strike, the police were in control. Those buses taking working miners, they all got through and took the miners into the pits. And it was the same in the Wapping dispute. When it came to the crunch, all of those lorries got through. There was never a day that Murdoch lost the newspaper production. And in my own mind, we have no evidence for this, but it's pretty clear that the police, had heard it from on high from Mrs. Thatcher, as we know happened in the miners' strike. Look, you've got to do all that you can to make sure that the print unions aren't going to win this one. We want the newspapers delivered. Murdoch's got every right, in the government's view, in Mrs. Thatcher's view, to get his newspapers out for sale. And of course, we have to remember that the Sun and the Times were very, very big supporters of Mrs. Thatcher, as of course was the News of the World and the Sunday Times.
There is another aspect to this, because I can remember interviewing a few years ago Dennis Pater, who worked here on the Bristol Post as a journalist back in the 1970s. And he said that the change from hot metal up to the new digital printing works it wasn't just a technological change, it was also a change in working practices, because he described to me how when he'd finished a story, he would get a call from downstairs once they'd actually set the story in hot metal, and he would then stand next to the printer just a few feet away, read his story in reverse, and he wasn't actually allowed to get within arm's reach of the printing machine.
No.
But the printing unions and the journalist unions had arranged this, whereby the journalist would check. He'd have to read it all backwards because it was all in metal and about to be used to print the story. And then he'd sign a little on a clipboard, a little piece of paper saying, yes, that's my story and it's all correct. And this was a way of ensuring that the journalists actually made sure that they got exactly what they'd written onto the page and into print. But with the new system, there were changes. And I remember speaking to Mark Honningsbaum at The Guardian after the 7/7 London bombings, because on the day he did a podcast saying the bombs were underneath the trains, that this is what people had been saying when they came out of the tube tunnels. And then in the next day's paper, and I asked him about this, he said he'd said that the bombs were inside the trains. And I phoned him up a few days after the attacks. And I said to him, Mark, well, how do you explain this difference between your podcast on the day of the bombings saying the bombs were underneath the trains, this is what people were telling you, and then your article says they were inside the trains? How do you explain that? And he paused for a good 15 seconds, and then he said, Tony, not everything I submit as copy ends up in the next day's paper. So something changed, didn't it, with this technology? Right. It wasn't just the technology, it was also the ability of journalists to ensure that exactly what they wanted to write was going to appear in the paper the next day.
Yes, you didn't have that same degree of oversight because, of course, the whole point was, and this was the Murdoch revolution. I described, you see, how I used to have to type my stories on a typewriter on a piece of paper and literally hand the piece of paper to a messenger. I was at Westminster, who would then take it to the printing works. So I didn't have oversight of my stories, but our chief sub-editor from the Times room at the House of Commons went down and looked at the page and checked all the stories. But of course, what happened with the computerized revolution is that you put your story into a computerized system, and of course, it pops up along the way. Other people are changing, amending. I'm putting the words in quotes, manipulating the story before it actually gets into the paper. And you're right, the journalist has lost control. Once he presses the button and says, I'm signed the story off as it is on my screen, that doesn't mean that's what's going to get into the paper.
Ultimately, what was the result? Did Murdoch just simply win?
Yeah, well, he won. In the end, the unions had to call it off because the support for it was just disappearing. Certain people were packing it in and taking the redundancy payments that were on offer. And as I said, the other newspaper proprietors were just applauding Murdoch. Now, you see, one of the other factors that's so important, you keep referring to it, Tony, the fact that people don't seem to have much of a memory of Wapping. Well, partly this is because the newspapers didn't and still don't report dog stories. So the newspapers don't often report the real truth about what's happening in the life of another newspaper. And it was in the interest of the newspaper proprietors to keep stories out of the public attention about Wapping, because they were all secretly gagging for him, hoping that he was going to win, because this was going to then lead to them being able to introduce new technology, slim down their workforces, and move on. So that was the sort of collusion that was happening. So there was very little reporting of what was happening at Wapping. The BBC and the other broadcasters, yes, we often had news bulletin reports of the violence, but within the newspapers themselves, it was like a story that just wasn't being reported. And the reason was because the newspaper proprietors did not want this to be publicized. They wanted Murdoch to win because then, they'd lined up the cash that they were going to buy out these other workers. You have to remember, this is one of the... we often talk about, industrial change in this country. Well, the redundancy payment is one of the things, you see, which has enabled industrial change to take place. Because, of course, when it came to the miners' strike, in the end, every pit closed, and with most of the, over half of the men at every pit agreeing to take redundancy, which was the reason why after the 1992 closures, when 30 were closed, even those great big, profitable pits, the men all voted by a majority to take the money, and they closed. And of course, that was a very important factor. And in the printing industry, I was told that the print redundancy payments were so big that the workers asked for them to be spread over 2 years to reduce the amount of tax that they would have to pay. But of course, the newspaper proprietors were only too delighted, because they were going to have in future just a fraction of the number of workers that they'd had under the old system.
Now, there's a big problem here. Surely the print unions were angry with the NUJ and the journalists' unions for just simply crossing the picket lines, Nick.
Well, half. That's exactly what happened. You see, a lot of the Times journalists crossed the line and went into work for Murdoch on the Monday morning. There were a lot of what we call refuseniks who refused to go. And it caused tremendous tension. You see, within the National Union of Journalists, they could never agree a policy as to what to do over this, because, there were a lot of loyal NUJ members who said, well, look, my life, my life is on the line with my earnings. I cannot not go to work. I cannot not go to work. Events have changed. I'm going to have to go to work. Of course, the refuseniks refused, and loyally to this day say they never took the Murdoch shilling. But the reality of it was that the NUJ was in this terrible problem, the National Union of Journalists, as to what to do. I happened to be that year the chair of the Labour and Industrial Group of Correspondents. Now, we had our own little group of people who reported industrial affairs. And we were faced by that same problem. You see, the people who were employed by Murdoch, who were not prepared to accept the offer and go to work for him, they were saying we should kick out any Times or Sun or Sunday Times or News of the World industrial correspondent. We should kick them out of the group. But it was a very, very difficult decision, because we had, the very loud voices saying we should support the people who were on strike, who joined the strike. And there were very, very powerful voices to say, well, look, we should, as a group, should not get involved. If they're industrial journalists, why shouldn't they go to work for Murdoch? You can see the dilemma. It's not as easy as it sounds, because, of course, we were a non-political group. We respected the fact that in the journalists, Labour and Industrial Correspondents group, we had all sorts of people. All you needed to do was to be somebody interested in reporting trade union and industrial affairs. We couldn't check on your politics, and we couldn't check when it came to a dreadful episode like the Murdoch episode. We couldn't dictate as to what you should do, and the National Union of Journalists was in the same dilemma. So you can see it's not an easy thing.
I just wonder, were there any? I mean, if I was a printer picketing the Wapping works and I saw journalists going in there, I would be every bit as angry with them as I would have been with a printer who was breaking the strike.
Exactly so, and that's why they were bussed in. They had to be bussed in, just like the working miners were, and there would be pickets there, throwing bricks and bottles at the coaches as they went in. But it was a fortified printing plant, and after a time when it was obvious that Murdoch, had won this one, it's sad to say, but I think, more and more people accepted that the writing was on the wall. And of course, you have to understand the timing of all of this. The miners, you see, who were the shock troops of the trade union movement, they'd been defeated in 1984-5. So that was the last, if you like, all-out strike, in the sense that it was the workers had all decided they were going to stop work and go on strike, come what may, no limit. Now then, the print workers did the same, but of course the justification there was that they'd all been sacked. So they were sort of, they were on strike because they'd been sacked. But what we have to look back on, Tony, is that there has not been another open-ended strike in this country since the miners and the Wapping disputes, because the unions have realized, you see, that you can't take your members out on an indefinite strike anymore. No one can afford it. And of course, this is what ate away at the support for the strike at Wapping. It was the hardship that was beginning to develop. And we saw in the miners' strike, didn't we, the hardship that developed there, and how the mining communities had to come together, to bring the families through it. Well, the same sort of hardship was happening in the printing dispute. The days when they got a pay packet were way, way, way back, and people were in hard times.
I remember reading recently about the miners' strike, where some of the miners were actually sent off up into the hills to shoot rabbits to feed the town.
They did, and brought them back, not just rabbits, pheasants, and everything else. Oh no, I mean that was the degree of hardship that there was. So I think when I look back on it all, I do have to say that one does wonder, you see, whether if there had been a more pragmatic level of union leadership, whether it might have been possible to have, negotiated secure jobs in the mining industry, better terms and conditions in the printing industry. If we look at it now, of course, I mean, the difference is phenomenal. I mean, back in the 80s, you see, the national newspapers, the daily sale of national newspapers, the 10 or 12 national newspapers, was something like 13 million copies a day. Well, now, of course, it's down to 3 million and dwindling fast. And of course, one of the sort of saddest ironies of it all. So if we can imagine Fleet Street humming like a great big printing works, because up and down Fleet Street were these big, tucked away behind the facades at the front, were these great big printing works where there were literally, great big rolls of newspapers were coming in, the hot metal plant was working away, the papers were coming off the production lines. Now there is just one big printing plant for most of the national newspapers in this country, in the southeast of England, and that is at just off junction 26 on the junction 25. Junction 25 on the M25 at the A10 turnoff. Murdoch got the permission for this great big printing plant. And what's happened is that the Daily Mail group, of course, they're a very, very big group, the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday and the Metro and all the others, they have now all reached a deal with Murdoch, and they're all printed in this one great big printing works just off the M25. So it's a sad moment for the print. I think printed newspapers will continue to a degree, but you can see it's very, very hard times for them.
What about the Labour Party during all this? Who was leading it, and what did they do? Did they take a role?
Well, there was a great big wish that the Labour Party should, and there was a demand that the Labour Party under Neil Kinnock, there was a demand that John Smith and then Tony Blair, who were the Labour leaders, should not deal with the Murdoch newspapers. They shouldn't talk to the journalists of the Murdoch press. Now, some Labour MPs steadfastly obeyed that rule. They wouldn't talk to journalists from The Sun. But, of course, you have to look at the fact. And the fact was, of course, that when Tony Blair took over from John Smith, he was very keen to work with Murdoch. And as we know, in 1997, The Sun came out with that famous front page, "We back Blair." There'd been a sort of secret liaison between Tony Blair. He'd even gone out to Australia to meet Murdoch. So they were keen to work with the Murdoch press. They accepted the power of the press. But again, it was one of those very bumpy times when a lot of Labour MPs, especially on the left, would have nothing to do with the journalists who were employed by Murdoch. I mean, that still resonates a bit today. If you go up to Liverpool, you'll find that there's a sort of ban there on The Sun because of what they said about the Hillsborough football stadium disaster, because they blamed the Liverpool fans. So there is that resentment still against the Murdoch press, and you hear it quite frequently. But it was very much the flavour of the times in the late 80s.
Well, one of the things, I mean, you've talked a bit about the censorship there, and this is particularly worrying, isn't it? And also the centralisation of power of the printing, one place printing everything. We want a diverse press. We want to have genuine independence of all these different publications. And I mean, obviously, if Rupert Murdoch has got the printing works, then that means he can quietly up and down costs and charges to all of the different newspapers.
That's right.
Depending on whether he likes what they're printing or not. But there is one I would just like to let listeners know about, an excellent film that we used to distribute actually online as a VHS video and then as a DVD by Spectacle Productions. it's called Despite the Sun. So if anyone is interested in really getting the insight, and actually quite a lot of the footage, you'll probably find yourself dashing about in there somewhere, Nick, I'd imagine. Yeah, so that's an hour-long documentary about the Wapping dispute. And you touched briefly there on this group of industrial correspondents, because what we were witnessing in these two disputes, in the coal dispute and at Wapping, was a slow sort of deindustrialization going on and deunionization going on. So can you say something about that group? Because I know you did actually publish a book called The Lost Tribe. It seems to me so important, because what you were doing was documenting what's now a major problem in Britain. Is we've got many cities that used to be industrial cities, Sheffield, Manchester, even here in Bristol, with almost no purpose to be there anymore because the industry has gone.
That's right. Well, the Labour and Industrial Correspondents Group was formed in the post-war years. The Labour government in the post-war years recognised the importance of, because that's when we had the arrangements, which of course were all demolished by Mrs. Thatcher, for sort of a degree of cooperation between employers and trade unions. There were tripartite organisations which represented government, unions and employers, and they tried to work things out together. So we became, as a group of journalists, we had the inside track with the trade union leaders and with the employers. And increasingly, when it was a Labour government with Labour ministers, especially if you think of the Labour governments of Harold Wilson, so we, the Labour and trade union correspondents and industrial correspondents, we were a very powerful group. You could say we were as powerful or even more powerful on some occasions than the political correspondents of today. But, rather like a sort of desert flower, we bloomed in the Thatcher decade, because in the start of the Thatcher decade, because industrial news was there in your face day after day, because of course she was taking on the trade union movement as part of her wish to privatize the nationalized industries. So if we take the 1980s, she closed the shipyards. You've just talked about Bristol in the southwest. There were shipyards down there. She then decided, she put in a man called Ian McGregor, who went on to become the coal board chairman. He began the job of slimming down the steel works, and there was a big all-out steel workers strike. Then, of course, came the car industry in British Leyland and the rationalisation there. And then, of course, came the miners' strike, and then came Wapping. But, of course, after that, Tony, what happened was union membership, which had been 12 million, was in free fall. And it was down to sort of 5 or 6 million by the end of the Thatcher decade. And what was so important is that the trade unions had realized, and this is partly because of the effectiveness of the government's employment laws, that there was no way that they could ever sustain all-out strikes. The idea that industrial strength alone could win the day, that, I'm afraid, was no longer the case. And what we saw increasingly was that the unions understood they had to work with the news media, and they had to try and win public attention and sympathy through the news media. So we increasingly see today, you see 1, 2, 3-day strikes with lots of protest marches and placards. What the unions are doing is they're sort of putting a marker down, indicating we're strong. We can stop the trains today and tomorrow and for the rest of the week. But of course, they can't stop them as they did in the 80s. We had rail strikes that went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Well, that couldn't be the case today. And of course, for the journalists like myself, we had sort of run out of road. I can well remember in 1989 in the BBC newsroom trying to get across stories about industrial change, because of course industrial change was continuing, and the newsrooms would say, Nick, get another job. Don't you realise it's over? There aren't going to be any more strikes. Mrs. Thatcher's won the day. We're not going to have power cuts and 3-day weeks and all of this, that, and the other. So, get yourself another job. That was the advice that I was getting. And of course, what happened was the poor old Labour and Industrial Correspondents Group, we struggled on. But finally, we had to throw in the towel. But I do have all the records of the group and our last membership. And I did write, as you rightly said, that little book all about the lost tribe, because I thought it was important that we explained that, there was a time when we did have a core of industrial labour and industrial correspondence. I mean, we have one or two now. There's one on the Tribune magazine. There's one on the Novara website. One or two of the national papers have people who look at trade union and industrial affairs. But we don't have a great big core of correspondence. But I think it's important that we remember that there was a day when that was the case. And to get back to your point, about the industrial deserts that we have. We also have, of course, a desert when it comes to the gathering of news. So what so disappoints me, Tony, as somebody who used to spend my time, I would go out on a story, I would go to a rail depot, I would go to a pit, I would talk to workers. Well, those days have gone now. You very rarely, if ever, see any reporting, in-depth reporting about the reasons for a dispute. One exception just recently has been the Amazon workers. There's been a really determined attempt to recruit union members at the Amazon warehouse distribution plants because Amazon refuses to acknowledge trade unions. So that is a campaign that's going on, and it is winning attention, but it's a sort of it's a bit of a sideshow, if I have to admit, when compared with the dramatic events of the miners' strike or the Wapping dispute. When you had all out strikes lasting for a year.
You're quite a bit modest, really, Nick, about the Lost Tribe book, because what you've done is, I think, a terrific job as an editor in getting lots of these industrial correspondents to write pieces, short pieces, some just a couple of pages, some a bit longer, about their experiences as correspondents during these sort of end of industry days. One of the ones that stands out to me is from Seamus Milne. I mean, he was a columnist and an associate editor, former Labour correspondent at The Guardian. Now, of course, his father was
Alistair Milne.
Alistair Milne, exactly,
yeah.
The BBC's Director General, who, maybe this is another interview, but there was all sorts of trouble with him back in the late 1980s and getting rid of him at the BBC. He says MI5's secret war. By the early 1980s, MI5's industrial unit had 12 desk officers backed up by a small army of handlers, agents and informers, technical and secretarial staff, guiding special branch and overseeing the service's own trade union work. MI5 also targeted Labour correspondents in both newspapers and broadcasting. According to Peter Wright, MI5 had always had about 20 senior journalists working for it in the national press. They were not employed directly by us, he explained, but we regarded them as agents because they were happy to be associated with us. According to one former officer, as many as 3/4 of the Labour correspondents at the time became informants of one type or other for the security service or special branch. That's a quote from Seamus Milne, The Enemy Within, MI5, Maxwell and the Scargill Affair, published by Verso Books back in 1994. So this aspect, I mean, I think most people didn't realise, certainly at the time, that the secret state was so active, if that's true.
I mean, Seamus has done a lot of research on this, and I've no doubt, knowing the Labour and Industrial Correspondence Group, and knowing, as I have explained, that a number of them, a considerable number of them, worked on newspapers of the right, newspapers that were pretty well closely aligned with the Conservatives. And I have no doubt that this is quite correct, that during times of stress, there would have been these links. And of course, it was a two-way trade. What you're not perhaps understanding is that, yes, there would have been security officers who would have spoken to some of these journalists. And of course, the journalists were getting tip-offs the other way. They were getting exclusive stories. So journalists like myself, I was in the BBC. I assure you, I never knowingly spoke to a security officer we can come back to that in a second, because there is a development there. But if we actually get to the era that we're talking about, of things like the miners' strike or the Wapping dispute, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that there might well have been contact. And what struck us, you see, during events like the miners' strike, was that often the national newspapers on the right, the supporting papers for Mrs. Thatcher, had high-grade tip-offs about what was happening. I mean, the most spectacular was the Sunday Times scoop about a man who worked for the miners' union called Roger Windsor ending up in Tripoli, asking Colonel Gaddafi for money to help with the miners' strike in 1984. Now, I can assure you that none of us knew, but I mean, how was it that the Sunday Times was in the right place at the right time to get information like that? They knew a lot about what had happened to the miners' money, because during the strike, the miners' own money was sequestrated and seized by the courts. So there was a lot of two-way traffic, I think, and that partly explains what's happened. But look, I've got to bring you straight up to date here, because there are two developments. I am part of an application to MI5 to see whether my phone was ever tapped, to see whether I was ever under surveillance. I've also made an inquiry and tried to become part of an inquiry that's called the Undercover Police Inquiry, which resumes in July. And most significantly of all, this inquiry, they have been looking into those cases where undercover police officers covering the big sort of demonstrations of the 70s and early 80s, like the CND or the various other big protest marches and events, whether they were under surveillance. Now, what happens is that we now know that there were undercover police officers who had romantic affairs, liaisons with activists, and in some cases that led to children being born, and that was why Mrs. Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, agreed to set up this inquiry into the work of undercover police officers. Well, just to cut to the quick, that inquiry resumes in July, and they are looking at strikes and events and protests from 1983 onwards. And that's led people like me, who covered the miners' strike, we believe our phones were tapped, to ask whether we can become participants in that inquiry in case there is any evidence about what happened during the miners' strike.
Well, it's a bit cheeky, really, isn't it? Because, I mean, this is an industrial dispute. MI5 and Special Branch should be deployed in stopping the KGB and these massive foreign intelligence services from infiltrating Britain. It's not really their job to even get involved in industrial disputes, surely.
But you've just hit on the very justification which was used by Mrs. Thatcher and the security services. You see, the minute that Arthur Scargill in the miners' strike sought the support of trade unions in the USSR, in the Soviet bloc, Colonel Gaddafi, and so on, that then posed a potential threat to the security of the UK. And that was used as a justification for all sorts of surveillance, which we now know took place. So if we can imagine the day when the miners' money is seized, they squirreled it away. Arthur Scargill had squirreled it away in a number of banks around Europe. And of course, it was all seized by the sequestrators Price Waterhouse, working on tip-offs from the security services, because, they'd followed the movement of the money and the people involved. So that's just an illustration of the degree to which there was considered to be a justification. What people like me are concerned about is that, I at my home used to get and would discuss on the phone aspects of the strike with Arthur Scargill. On one day, I remember giving him a lift. This was soon after the Battle of Orgreave, all the way from North Wales to his flat in the Barbican. And he told me afterwards, he didn't tell me at the time, but when we'd stopped at the service station, the cops had come along and tapped on the window and said, "Mr. Scargill, you're not in your usual car. Are you okay?" So I was being followed by the cops. So I have to sort of say, well, I would quite like to know to what degree was there undercover police, work during the miners' strike affecting journalists. And Seamus Milne has written this sort of great big piece alleging that many of the correspondents were in the pay of the security services or under the influence of the security services. I have every belief that there might well have been some of that cross-fertilization going on, but I've got, as I said, we've got no evidence yet, although we understand it is the case, the journalists in the miners' strike were under police surveillance as well.
This Spycops, I think it's this is the way it's been labelled, the Spycops.
Yep, it is.
Inquiry.
Exactly, you've got it on the net.
It's really a kind of politicisation. They're looking at, for example, amazing stories coming out of that, such as it looks as if the leader of the environmental groups, which were shutting down coal-fired power stations back in the noughties, were actually police. Can you just say something about this sort of difficult position of infiltrating groups and controlling them? Because we don't really know if a group is thoroughly infiltrated, whether it's really a group with its own mind at all, or whether the state has taken control of it.
Well, that's exactly so. Now, I mentioned this man, Roger Windsor. Now, he was the chief executive of the National Union of Mine Workers and had come to the union's attention because he was very good at international trade union affairs. Now, I mean, there are allegations which Roger Windsor stoutly denies that he too was a plant. So, I mean, these allegations are swirling around. There's no doubt about it if you look at the miners' strike in particular. I mean, I researched a story when it was quite clear that Scargill phones had been tapped, because it was all about whether or not he was taking pills during the strike, towards the end of the strike. McGregor asked me, why is he still taking the tablets? Police officers I knew who asked me, is Scargill still taking the tablets? Well, in the end, in the February of 1984, I did stop Arthur Scargill. I asked him about this, and I said, look, I keep getting these suggestions. I've got to ask you, are you still taking the tablets, you see? I mean, it sounded like a joke, didn't it? Well, he said, yes, I am taking some tablets. I'm taking some vitamin pills. But he said, it's very interesting that you should ask me about it, he said, because I had to seek the advice of a couple of alternative doctors. The point is, I'm not eating properly. I do need vitamin supplements, and I did need advice. And he said, look, it's another example of, it sounds innocuous, but I mean, they could only be teasing journalists to ask the question because of the fact that, they listened into his phone calls and knew that he was taking tablets. I mean, nobody else knew that he was taking a vitamin pill, but you can just see, it sounds totally innocuous, Tony.
Yeah, you can imagine. Yeah, sorry.
What it illustrates, I've just explained to you, is this two-way trade, you see. Here, a senior police officer suggested to me, I asked Scargill, are you taking the tablets? Well, why did a senior police officer suggest that to me? You see, and that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about, this cross-fertilization between the police, the security services, and journalism. It is a murky world.
One of the questions this throws up in my mind, very simple question, is did they get it all wrong, the union strategists, both at Wapping and in the miners' strike? I mean, particularly having these all-out strikes. Would you be seeing a different landscape today, or was it inevitable that both the old print unions and the National Union of Mine Workers were going the way of all flesh? That really was, they were going to be history, whatever they did, really.
Well, in the miners, I did quite a lot of investigations into it. It was very interesting. You see, in the early 80s, there was a lot of work being done by the Coal Board on developing clean burn technology, new ways of burning coal so that it was clean. I mean, we know all about now carbon capture and all of these various developments. Well, they were being looked at in the early 80s, and they were also looking at the liquefaction of coal to turn it into oil. Now, all of these research projects were going on because, of course, the Coal Board was getting money from the government of the day to invest in these new ideas. And, of course, they were waiting, the coal industry was waiting for the go-ahead to build the next generation of power stations, which would be clean burn. But of course, after the strike, Mrs. Thatcher cut the financing of all this, and it all went down the toilet. It all has disappeared. There's nothing happening. So that's one of the great tragedies. Now, therefore, the question that we have to think of is, if it had been possible to have had forward-looking leaders. I mean, I'm sounding like Mrs. Thatcher, but I'm just making the point. If it had been possible to have had union leaders who could have said, well, look, we can see the writing on the wall. There's probably, if we keep in this country, and there were 180 pits, let's be realistic. There might be a real long-term future for 40 of the super pits of this country. If we get a new working agreement, we'll have to slim down the workforce. There'll probably be, instead of 180,000 miners, just 40 or 50,000. But we might be able to negotiate a long-term future. Now, people have told me that was on the cards. That's what the coal board wanted to do. They wanted to try and get there. But of course, the unions had adopted under Arthur Scargill this very clear position that there were going to be no pit closures unless they were being closed, unless they were making a loss. If there was coal there, it would have to be mined. And that was the sort of condition, you see. They wouldn't sign a no-strike deal. And that was the sort of condition which prevented the continuation of the expansion in the coal industry, the continuation of the expansion in clean burn technology. When you come to the printing industry, you see, the print unions refused to agree to a no-strike deal. If we look at certain industries, those deals have been struck, in some of the Japanese companies that have come to this country and brought new investment. There are no strike agreements. There are deals to prevent industrial action, to ensure the continuous supply. And one has to sort of wonder whether that would have been possible. But then, of course, I have to be realistic and say, look at reality. And the reality is that we have a world conglomerate like Amazon, which is refusing to acknowledge trade unions, refusing to recognize them. And this valiant fight is being fought at a number of these Amazon plants to sign up enough people to actually be able to demand union recognition. They're putting up a valiant fight, Tony, but they haven't succeeded yet.
The book, The Lost Tribe, which goes into quite a lot of this is particularly the industrial correspondence. I suppose the obvious question to ask you about that, Nick, is who do you think was really behind this deindustrialization? Why was it going on? Who was directing it? Was it can't surely have just have been Mrs. Thatcher herself?
No, there was no doubt. I mean, she was the representative, the cheerleader for the whole group within the country who believed that, we had to have this freewheeling economy, rather like America, that we didn't need nationalized industries. Why did we need a nationalized car industry? Why did we need a nationalized shipbuilding industry with this massive number of workers? Just look at what was happening, you see, in the mid to late 70s, when these industries were nationalized. The British Leyland was nationalized, the shipbuilding industry was nationalized, the Steel Corporation. These nationalized industries were created. And because of something called the closed shop, the terms and conditions under which you almost had to become a trade union member, by 1979, trade union membership in this country was up to 12 million, largely as a result of the closed shop. One union, the Transport and General Workers, as it was called, they had 2 million members. Now, those were mega trade unions. And of course, they were the people, theirs was the power which Mrs. Thatcher was determined should be smashed. Of course, she smashed it in the coal industry. Murdoch smashed it in the printing industry. And what we've got is, this freewheeling economy. But you've only got to look down at the southwest and ask the question, has water privatization, in whose interest has been best served by water privatization? Yeah. And I think the country would come out pretty quickly and say, well, certainly not the consumers.
No. And in fact, they're now looking at refinancing these privatized water companies, which will mean massive increases in domestic bills, rather than literally either regulating them into the ground or else simply saying, well, we're going to take them back into public ownership, because this free market economics is almost like has become like a religion. But anyway, also this week, Nick, we've had a rather surprising announcement of a general election by Rishi Sunak in the rain. Were you surprised?
I was surprised, but not totally surprised. I think there's no doubt when you look at the sort of what's going on behind the scenes is that clearly he realizes that stringing this out to November could make it even worse for the Conservative Party. You know, the public's patience with it all is rapidly running out. I think, too, he's got problems within the Conservative Party. You know, it is a very unstable political party with a lot of politicians who are sort of determined to have a sort of, you know, leadership parade, and this could all go on in the summer months. And then there's the bigger unknown as to what might happen on the economy. And I think Rishi Sunak, who I judge as a sort of very capable technocrat. I mean, he's very good at making sort of technical decisions, whether you agree with them or not. He makes them and you know, has a strategy. Whether it's working again, that's another question. But he is a good technocrat. And I think he must have looked at this and thought, look, it would be much better for me to go now and call everyone's bluff, catch everyone off by surprise, and go for it now, because I think he's got a sort of a bit of the wind behind him. And I think that they realized that if they hung on and hung on and hung on, it would only get worse. That clearly was what happened to John Major in 1997. You see, he hung on and hung on. Everybody thought he was going to go earlier, and he didn't. And of course, by hanging on, there were more scandals in the Conservative Party. There was more trouble. They were in the middle of privatizing British Rail. Then there was you know, they were getting rid of the nationalized industry in British Rail, and that was the final act of the major government, and they hung on to complete it. But you can see that it got even worse as the months dragged on. It became even more likely that the Tories were going to be slaughtered. And I think that probably Rishi Sunak, if he looked at his spreadsheet, could probably see when he came to weigh up the balance sheet that the risk was better to take the risk now than to hang on to a fag end in November.
Yeah, well, maybe he was looking at computer models. Who knows? Anyway, what about the Labour Party these days? It's a very different institution to that which did all this nationalisation after World War II and carried through the sort of fight against privatisation, isn't it?
That's right. Well, it's a completely changed party, isn't it? I mean, one has to look at the way, and of course, this is always one of the things that is fascinating to me, is that you see, when we saw how of course, after Neil Kinnock lost the election in 1992 and he resigned, we then had John Smith as the leader, as the Labour leader. He died suddenly, and Tony Blair took over. But once Tony Blair took over, and once, you know, there was this sort of mood about him that everybody thought, well, he's a bit of a winner. He could pull it off. Everything sort of coalesced around him. And again, of course, the Conservatives were coming out of 18 years in government. It's even more now. It's less now at 14 years, but even so, it was a hell of a long time. And I think there was no doubt about it that everything sort of began to sort of coalesce around the Blair machine. And one feels the same thing has been happening now, that perhaps the momentum between Rachel Reeves and her approaches to big business, or Wes Streeting with his ideas for the National Health Service, perhaps they are helping to sort of create this wave of I hate to use the word enthusiasm. That would probably be decried by some, but certainly there's a positive wave behind the Labour movement at the moment. They really seem to think that they've got ideas and plans that could actually benefit the country, and they're determined to have a go. And I think once that sort of momentum builds up, it does become, you know, a pretty formidable election fighting machine. And if we compare it with the Conservatives, you know, they are a clapped out thing, whereas the Labour Party are really on the go. And you know, I think we have to look at it in that way. Yes, the Labour Party has changed, but we have to say, and I'm looking at it as somebody, I think I'm coming up to my 16th general election, you really do feel the momentum behind the Labour machine.
So almost no need to ask you who your money's on. But look, what
Well,
about your expertise though in which is in looking at industry? I mean, the country is very much in the doldrums in terms of for a lot of people, young people starting work.
mm,
Their first job sometimes doesn't even get them out of poverty nowadays.
no.
Well, that's even with two people working in the same household. So, is there anything that these parties have got to offer in order to restore people's finances, their hope in the future, ability to invest in, buy a house for their kids, and that sort of thing? Because all that seems to have gone, and we seem to be getting now a lot of messages from our political parties, which are sort of negative messages, saying, "Well, we will save you from the Russians. We will save you from the terrorists." And there just seems to be very little actual vision.
Well, I mean, a bit of a correction there. I mean, if you take housing as an example and the determination of Labour, to unlock these years of planning disputes, to take tough decisions on what they call the grey belt. That's where the green belt around the big cities has been eroded away, and where house building should take place. I live in North London. We're surrounded by sites where there's been a failure to develop. Now, if Labour came in and started a massive house building program and it really took off, there's no doubt the house builders would be for it, because the things would really take off, and that could help transform things.
Well,
Equally,
no, not necessarily, because what we really need, surely, is council housing, social housing, affordable housing.
Yes. But I mean, if we came up with a formula, which is what Labour seem to be promising, that they're going to unlock sites where it's going to be possible to build affordable housing close to existing city centre, close to existing conurbations. I mean, if this happened, then that might alter the equation. And if it was made something that the house builders could go along with, something that they liked. If you have to think back, I mean, the transformation that's happened, for example, I mean, I remember it well in the 60s, when the very first council houses were sold in the late 60s. Now, selling council houses was completely something that sort of which the Conservatives brought in, was something that, I mean, Mrs. Thatcher put booster rockets under it, but it had started in the late 60s. Now that changed the whole the whole atmosphere. But what came out of it, of course, was the development of housing associations. Now, they have transformed the scene. A lot of the housing associations, which would provide social housing, say, if a government came in and if it provided, the starting gun for sorts of developments in which the housing associations could take part, they would take part. They're keen to do that, you see. So I think one has to admit that there has been, under the Conservatives, they have failed to unlock the planning system. They've failed to work with the housing association sufficiently to get the boost that we need in affordable housing. Now, what happens here? I mean, as I said, I live in North London. We have scheme after scheme where the builders promise that there will be a 30 or 40% number of affordable homes in the development. The closer it gets to them building it, they whittle it down, and they then say to the councils, well, I'm sorry, if you don't give us approval, we can't go ahead with it. They hold the pistol to the head of the Conservative local authorities in Outer London. Well, Labour are saying they're not going to put up with that.
Yeah.
They're going to make sure that these things go ahead.
Yeah, this
well,
is
that
the
could
sort of
transform things.
the NIMBY syndrome.
The NIMBY,
Yeah.
and again, the same thing applies, Tony. If you take to the sort of developments that could happen on renewable energy, the development of new reservoirs, you name it. I mean, if somebody grasped the nettle, some of these things could be sorted out. They haven't been sorted out, have they? If
No.
you take the National Health Service, and if someone was prepared to bite the bullet on how you sort of revolutionize working practices in the National Health Service. I mean, a lot of change needs to take place. We all recognize that, don't we? But it is often difficult to get it through. But so my own hunch is that the Labour team under Keir Starmer, just as sort of Clement Attlee, if you like. I mean, the comparison isn't sort of comparable in many ways, but I mean, the point was that there was this great movement behind the Labour movement in the post-war years, and they were determined to do things differently. I mean, that's why the Labour and Industrial Correspondents were formed, because we had a Labour minister who said, look, I'm going to talk to the Labour and Correspondents. I'm going to give them an office in the Department of Employment. We want to have a three-way conversation. Of course, that all disappeared under Mrs. T. I mean, people like me were, and the BBC and everybody else, we're considered outcasts. We still are considered outcasts, but you can see how things can change. And my feel is that we could well see some of these developments taking place on house building, on energy development, in the National Health Service. Now, whether that turns out to be the case or not, I think is open to question, Tony, but I think we certainly have to admit that there is the momentum there in the Labour machine behind Keir Starmer to try to deliver some of those changes, the sort of changes which you can see the Conservative Party at the moment just cannot deliver. It cannot get agreement. It cannot take on the NIMBYs. It cannot take on the NIMBYs on, more wind farms or whatever it is. It cannot bridge that gap between the private and the National Health Service. Labour say they can find ways to do that. So I think we'd have to say that the country probably, if we took the sort of temperature at the moment, would probably say, well, yeah, go for it.
Final question is about Brexit, because this apparently afforded Britain great opportunities to take back control of its industrial policy. And yet, really, we haven't seen any of that. And there's certainly nothing so far in any of the major political parties, apart from actually the tiny George Galloway Workers' Party that's talking about this at all, Nick.
That's right. I think the fear is on the Labour side. They just fear the power of the Conservative press in this country, because although we were talking about it and talked about how the national newspapers just sell a mere fraction, 3 million copies today, but the power of the Conservative machine is supported by the Conservative press. All the columnists and commentators, so many of them appear on social media, on sympathetic these new radio channels. If you turn on the telly, one test and see a sort of, the panels that are set up. The predominance is to have talking heads from the right. The left is very badly underrepresented, because if you take, for example, Labour think tanks, they're just a mere shadow of what they used to be, because, of course, they've lacked the funding. The trade unions haven't got the members. The trade unions aren't supporting left-wing publications. So the number of left-wing commentators and journalists and think tank people is a fraction of what it used to be in the 70s and 80s. And that's because, partly because of the decline of the left, and especially the left in the trade union and Labour movement. And the Conservatives, I think, know that immigration is that fear factor story. And of course, it's inextricably linked to Brexit. How was the referendum won? I think it was won on the fear factor. Farage and Boris Johnson and everybody else put across this line that you've got to vote for Brexit, because if you don't, we're going to be flooded with immigrants. I mean, we saw the stories time and time again. They exploited the fear factor of immigration for political purposes. And I think Labour fear that if they start talking about things like Brexit and immigration and get too deeply involved, the Tory commentators, there'll be a sort of cascade coming down from the Conservative newspapers, and it'll be followed through, as I said, in all of the talk shows, on all of the social media platforms. We have to recognize that the right in this country dominates many of these platforms. And, it's a tragedy, but that is the reality of it. I mean, there aren't as many journalists think tank people on the left as they should be, as I think they should be. And that's a tragedy. And that's what Labour fear. And that's why they won't tackle an issue like Brexit until they get into power, because they know that if they dare put a foot in the water, it can be used against them by the Conservative machine.
So do you think maybe when Starmer gets in, we will rejoin the EU?
Well, I think there's no doubt we'll have a much more positive relationship with the EU. How far it will go is open to question. But at the moment, it's a sort of red line. Labour just dare not talk about it because they fear that it would just be used against them. I mean, you've only got to look at Reform and GB News, all of these platforms which are in the, and look, some of them are in the ascendancy. It's a worrying time for the left, because they know that they could really be damaged. We saw it in the 2019 general election. We saw it in the Brexit referendum. That, my word, that can turn people out if you frighten them enough. And they were certainly frightened, and many people still are frightened over immigration. You've only got to go to places in the West Country where there isn't where you don't have large numbers of people moving in, but people there are very, very concerned about immigration. So it's one of those issues which, unfortunately, can be exploited by politicians.
It certainly can, Nick. And one thing that seems to be taboo, we've been talking about a few taboos at the end of this interview here, is this idea that migrants are providing very cheap labour, which is undermining any kind of paying conditions in the union world.
That's right. And that, of course, again, is an issue which is of great concern on the left, that because of the lack of regulation, that is the reality, and it's something which is of great concern to a lot of people.
And this is the world that Margaret Thatcher and her successor Tony Blair have created. Anyway, look, your book, I really did enjoy reading. You edited, is The Lost Tribe: Whatever Happened to Fleet Street's Industrial Correspondents, by Nicholas Jones. But how can listeners get hold of copies, Nick?
Well, I've got a website in my own name. If anybody writes to me, I'm more than happy to post them off a copy. It was a self-published book, you see. The point was I had this bee in my bonnet about it, and I thought, well, I'm never going to get funding, so I'll publish a book. And we had a sort of farewell party, and I thought it was just worth putting my hand in my pocket and writing something and getting it published, which I have and did, as a sort of memorial to those golden years when Industrial Correspondents ruled the airwaves. Not the case now.
And the other thing we touched on was the documentary for Channel 4, Despite the Sun, how Rupert Murdoch destroyed Fleet Street. You can get a copy of that from Spectacle Productions, which is spectacle.co.uk, Mark Saunders' old production company. In January 1986, Rupert Murdoch, he says, moved his printing operation, News International, from Fleet Street to Wapping. Over 5,000 print workers, clerical staff, cleaners and secretaries were sacked in one day. He broke the traditionally strong printers union and he banned the NUJ. Good God, I didn't know that. Is that true?
Well, yes, he wouldn't recognise the NUJ. I mean, banded is a sort of bit of a moot word. I mean, I think some of the time journalists remained NUJ members, but when they say they banned it, I mean, he no longer negotiated with it. He no longer recognised it as a union.
He refused to talk to the unions, even though NUJ members were working for him.
And continue. And of course, this was part of the dilemma that faced the National Union of Journalists as to what to do. But of course, they had to recognise that in the end, they represented journalists, and the difficulty in getting involved in disputes, in a secondary way like that, is very, very awkward and uncomfortable.
Well, really, it's got to be up to the individual members. If they can't just simply be told what to do by a general secretary. Anyway, look, Nicholas Jones, can you just remind us of your website finally?
Yes, I'm nicholasjones.org.uk, and you can send me a message.
Nicholas Jones, thank you very much for joining us once again.
Thank you.